Feminist activism thrives under three conditions. In societies with female mobility, economic development, and democratization. And a key driver here is labor-intensive growth. I am Dr. Alice Evans, a lecturer in international development at King's College London, and I study the global history of gender. So it's about why all societies have become more gender equal, but why some are more gender equal than others.
Welcome to this podcast produced by the International Monetary Fund. I'm Bruce Edwards. Global disparities between women and men have narrowed over the 20th century, but despite the strong evidence of the benefits of closing the gender gap, progress has been slow in many parts of the world. Dr. Alice Evans has studied women movements across the globe and written extensively on the topic. She was invited by the IMF Africa Department to talk about how feminist activism helps women overcome barriers to greater economic autonomy and is key to achieving gender equality. So gender equality is an issue that the IMF has been working on, in the past few years especially. But it's not every day that IMF economists have seminars about feminist activism. Before we get into it, what was your reaction when you were invited to do this?
Oh, I was very flattered and honored and excited to share with them because the IMF works on economic development. And as a result of economic development, women have enjoyed falling fertility, rising education, many have gained economic autonomy. But even with economic development, a woman may still be sexually harassed on city streets, unfairly treated at work, and abused at home. And those patriarchal practices can persist as long as women remain silent, secluded, divided, and despondent. So I was trying to highlight that with feminist activism, women critique unfair practices, they mobilize nationwide, they push for more egalitarian laws and demand enforcement. That is absolutely cardinal to gender equality.
But how can they support this idea of feminist activism, in the work that they do on a daily basis?
Well, I think there are two ways. One is one can directly support women's movements. So, for example, partnering with feminist activists and municipal governments to make cities safer for women. Or, I think perhaps more likely, is that to recognize the enabling environment for feminist activism. So feminist activism thrives under three conditions in societies with female mobility, economic development, and democratization. And a key driver here is labor-intensive growth. Because employers the world over tend to prefer men. They see men as more reliable and more productive. But when labor demand is strong, when employers really need more workers, then they reluctantly hire more women, so you see higher female employment and closing gender wage gaps. So what I'm really hoping now is that the IMF could just crack that nut of how to generate more labor-intensive growth, we would see higher female employment. And that is especially important for feminist activism because it's by getting jobs women gain economic autonomy so they could leave abusive men, but also through coming into the public sphere, women forge female friendships. They come to bitch and moan about the patriarchy, complain about unfair practices. And then those female friendships gained through work in the public sphere or clubs and societies are really the foundations for feminist activism. So what the IMF can do, what they can learn from is just power on with labor-intensive growth.
So the world has progressed dramatically on so many levels in the past century or couple of centuries. How is it that misogyny is still so deeply entrenched in so many countries?
Right. I think that's a real challenge. I think there are two regions in particular which have had economic development and yet gender inequalities persist. And there are slightly different explanations. So, for example, in the Middle East and North Africa, discriminatory family laws are maintained by powerful religious authorities. And they have consistently vetoed any attempts for reform. So in the Middle East and North Africa, you have economic growth fueled by the oil boom, but progress is constrained by powerful religious authorities. In South Asia, in India in particular, you have economic boom, but the problem is that female employment is low. And that's partly reflects a culture whereby once families are economically prosperous, women tend to withdraw from the labour market, especially in rural areas. But as long as women remain secluded and separated, then those two problems apply, that they're less likely to collectively critique unfair practices, and they also lack the economic autonomy to challenge dominant men. In China, there have been repeated demonstrations against sexual harassment and sexual abuse, but the state was worried about public dissent, and so it cracked down on those. And as a result, those women's movements tended to demobilize. And once they're underground, it becomes so much harder to gain visibility. So there are those three big constraints: authoritarianism, female seclusion alongside economic prosperity, and also powerful religious authorities. And those can persist alongside economic growth.
So, as I was looking through your many papers, I came across a couple of charts that I thought were interesting that show women's representation in legislatures and how it has increased or not, in different regions and countries around the world since 1997. So how is it that Latin America has done so well compared to Asia or Europe, for that matter? I mean, you see numbers in Bolivia and Ecuador, for example, soar in the past 20 years. How is it that they've done so well as compared to other regions?
Right, absolutely. It's incredible, the rate of rapid change, because in the first post-transition elections in much of Latin America, those legislators were 95% male. So it's not like this is an egalitarian continent, but there are several distinguishing features of Latin America. One is weak constraints on female mobility, democratization, and development. So with weak constraints on female mobility, female employment rapidly rose from the 1970s, with enabling, it was associated with falling fertility, rising education. It then enabled increased networking. Women joined communal kitchens. They gathered in the public sphere. They critiqued patriarchal practices. They discussed and decried femicides and abuses. They joined urban social movements. They protested. They disappeared. They joined protests for democratization. So there are a couple of things. And so that culture of democratization emboldened feminist activists. Women came to see that they could change the laws of the land through relentless activism. And so in Latin America, we see these encuentros, these regional and national networks of women coming from landless people's movements, from indigenous people's movements, from all different sectors of society, sharing and debating their common struggles and identifying and naming patriarchal abuses. And that really emboldens them. They share ideas. So Latin America is unique for these three respects. This weak constraints on female mobility, unlike the practices and the traditions of purdah and seclusion in South Asia or the Middle East. Two is the democratization. It's not just that democratization enables feminist movements, but enables this culture of resistance. And the third issue is the economic development. So women responded to the rising demand for cheap, docile labor, education, etc. And also, along with economic development, you have some state capacity enabling enforcement. And that's very different from, say, sub-Saharan Africa. So with weak constraints on female mobility, democratization and development, then we saw relentless feminist activism. Now, the first post-transition elections were dominated by men. Women decried their marginalization from political decision-making. And male legislators acquiesced a little with these gender quotas, but they were very, very weak and they added lots of loopholes. But women in public office and civil society, they maintained the momentum. They pushed for higher thresholds. They pushed for stronger enforcement. They closed those loopholes. And so that enabled stronger gender quotas, higher female representation. And by seeing women in office, that increased citizen support because they saw that women were equally capable of being legislators. So they started voting for them. And that really shifted expectations because emboldened feminists then campaigned for gender parity in everything. They started demanding women's equal participation across a range of domains. So now 10 Latin American countries now require gender balance among legislative candidates. And with stronger quotas, Argentina, Bolivia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Mexico, Nicaragua now elect an average of 46% of women to their lower or single chamber of commerce. And Mexico's 2019 constitution mandates gender parity for the executive, the judiciary, and state organs. And in Chile, just last year, women marched, they staged protests, and they wrote op-ed pieces demanding a constitutional assembly with gender parity. And voters approved. They said, never again without women. So why have we seen soaring representation? It's the deep-rooted cultural factor, weak constraints on female mobility, coupled with democratization and development, and then this relentless activism.
Well, that's impressive, all within essentially 20 years. So another thing that you mentioned that undercuts these gender quotas is underdevelopment. And yet, using that, referring back to that same chart, it shows Sub-Saharan Africa has surpassed North America in terms of seats in government held by women. Or what's happening in Sub-Saharan Africa? Are they doing something right, or is it that North America has lost its way?
Well, Sub-Saharan Africa has intrinsic potential for gender equality. It's just held back by underdevelopment. So women have always been integral to hoe cultivation, which is predominant in Sub-Saharan Africa. So they've always been present in the public sphere. They've always been important in societies. Not necessarily matriarchal, but they've always played a role in the public sphere. And this was accelerated, actually, through many recent bloody, brutal conflicts. So in Liberia, in Uganda, in Rwanda, women became breadwinners. They became heads of households, community organizers, leaders in peace movements, and they organized to repair the damage. And through undertakings, traditionally masculine roles, women came to perceive themselves as capable, strong, and autonomous. Through seeing women in those masculine roles, people came to question their gender ideologies, and that led to growing support for women leaders in parliaments, executive branches, government bureaucracies, judiciaries, and civil society. And engaging in that post-conflict process, African women's movements pressed for quotas, and they were very successful, especially successful in authoritarian aid-dependent countries where rulers wanted to improve their international reputations. So partly this is about a history of gender equality in these countries. It's also about moments of rupture and seizing those windows of opportunity with women's movements. But do high rates of female representation in Africa necessarily indicate that it's more gender equal than the USA? No, because some of that is strategic to improve their international reputations. And bear in mind that inequalities may persist on the ground.
And you also stress the importance of communications as a means to empower feminist activism, and how seclusion and isolation that women often experience in rural areas, especially in Africa, holds them back. Will the urbanization of the world's population, which is a trend that's happening now in a big way, will that urbanization trend help advance the cause for women's rights, do you think?
Well, if certain conditions are met. So, cities enable people to come together to share ideas with diverse others, and potentially women can be inspired and emboldened. So, for example, I did work in urban Cambodia, and I heard about girls seeing that other girls down the street had got homework, and they were jealous, so they pushed their parents to send them to school. Or for another case, a Cambodian garment worker. She was in a rent room, and her neighbor was asking her husband to share the domestic work. And so she was like, well, yes, I work, so my husband should also share the domestic work. And she said to her husband, yes, I want you to start washing the dishes. He said no. And so she felt indignant and divorced him. So absolutely through diversity, propinquity, heterogeneity, cities can cultivate social change because they enable people to become emboldened. They enable this snowballing process of social change. Yes. Also, in urban areas, there tend to be better government services, and that helps gender equality. So, for example, the police being more responsive, easier to control fertility because you're closer to health clinics. But, this is conditional. This is conditional on women actually leaving the home and getting a job and associating with diverse others, which we don't see in the Middle East and North Africa, and we certainly don't see in much of South Asia. Also depends on how responsive that government system is, so whether those services are any good. So urbanization should help in conditions with high female employment.
So there are so many things that work against this huge issue of gender equality and at so many levels. Is there something that we can all do, a small thing that might help put gender inequality behind us?
Well, I think sometimes inequalities can persist due to what I call a despondency trap. If people observe other people in their communities, and they then infer that there's widespread support for those practices. It may be that some people are privately supportive, but comply with them because they want to be liked and respected. And so that can cultivate what we call pluralistic ignorance and a despondency trap, because potential allies remain invisible. So what's really important is to publicize support for gender equality. And let me give one example for that. With sexual harassment, not just saying I support victims as a sort of performative statement, but for institutions to publicize zero tolerance of abuse. Because then perpetrators learn that they cannot get away with it, and victims learn that they can secure accountability. So then they're so much more likely to take their claims forward. So that's one thing organizations can do. Organizations can demonstrate their support for gender equality in practice, because then that would lead to increased reporting, such as in the case of sexual harassment.
Yeah, and institutions, perhaps, what's their role in all this?
I think one really good question that I was asked in the talk was, well, how do we prevent isomorphic mimicry? How do we ensure that we're not just seeing a good practice in one place and replicating elsewhere? And the answer I gave was, well, this is why feminist movements are so important. Women gathering together, critiquing unfair practices, then organizing nationwide. So it's a matter of listening to women and what they prioritize. And so I can't give a single thing that every institution could do. What each institution should do is to listen to the women there and to invite women to decision-making bodies and to hear what they have to say. So they can be responsive to women in their organization who know the major constraints.
Dr. Alice Evans, lecturer at King's College London. Thanks so much for this, and I look forward to your upcoming book, The Great Gender Divergence.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Alice Evans is also a podcaster. Check out her podcast, Rocking Our Priors, at draliceevans.com.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Dr. Alice Evans is also a faculty associate at the Center for International Development in Harvard's Kennedy School. You can find links to her articles and research at draliceevans.com. And there are plenty more IMF podcasts like this one if you're interested. Find them wherever you get your podcasts and subscribe if you like what you're hearing. You can also follow us on Twitter at IMF_podcast. Thanks for listening.